Okay, so what do you think, John?
What do I think? I think that the vast majority, I think, first of all, assuming that this would apply to individual Americans abroad, I think the vast majority of them could not comply with this if they wanted to.
Yeah, no, I don't know how you do this without paying a mint in accounting fees, because these are not numbers that are going to come straight out of your corporation's books and records, because you're supposed to be doing this in U.S. Accounting standards, U.S. dollar. I mean, the whole thing.
It can't be done. The best anybody could do would be some kind of an approximation. I think that's the very best.
And it might be that the best answer is to do a reasonable approximation and just file that, rather than pay all the accounting fees, if you decide that this applies to you.
Well, I mean, that is a really, really big decision, isn't it? Because, I keep coming back to this. It's one thing to talk about this abstractly, but when we're talking about people's private pension plans, it's a different matter altogether.
Yeah.
People are going to have to do some soul searching. I mean, I'm not even sure, what I would advise somebody to do on this. How to make the decision. I think the dumbest thing you could do is ask a tax compliance person whether it applies.
Yeah, well, you ask a hammer what, and they're going to be looking for a nail, right? Tax compliance person is going to be looking for a tax return.
Well, but it's more than that. Okay, I mean, they're in a position where they have to sign off on these returns, and in general,
that makes them very conservative, doesn't it?
Well, it makes them, it makes it so that it's a lot easier for them to take positions that are helpful to the IRS.
Yeah.
Because not only, we have no realization event. They're talking about money that was earned legally, taxed legally in other countries, and was not subject to U.S. taxation at the time that it was earned.
Right.
And now you've got, the possible interpretation that somehow this goes back for Americans abroad. And, all this money that was never previously taxed, okay, and legally earned and declared, okay, et cetera, is now somehow subject to U.S. taxation. How do you advise somebody in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like they're trying to reach into a corporation that they can't tax. Do the treaties and tax them through the back door. And really, I think our home governments need to step up and use the treaties that they have and the mutual agreement procedures that are in the treaties to agree with the IRS that this was never meant to apply to Australian or Canadian corporations owned by Australian and Canadian residents.
Yeah, but we're talking about this from the point of view of the residents. I mean, I think that's one aspect of it. I mean, countries like all countries have an interest in encouraging, not only allowing, but encouraging people to be able to save and plan responsibly for retirement.
It's a major cornerstone of the public policy here in Australia with the superannuation.
In Canada, okay, I think more so. I think Australia does a lot better than Canada does. But, so here we have a U.S. law that is clearly an affront to that policy. But what it also is, tell me why this isn't just a preemptive strike at Canadian capital that should be taxed by the Canadian government.
Well, it's a preemptive strike at the capital of Apple as well. I mean, everybody's been following the law. But yes, you're in the case of an individually owned corporation that's been organized outside of the U.S. by a resident of that country, then this is a strike at the tax base of that country. Yeah, and those governments should see it that way.
Yeah, and I think that they should take steps, to put an end to this. I mean, I think that this probably, as you know, I mean, I help people deal with these problems of U.S. citizenship. And, I think this probably is, the final indignity, should it apply, the final breaking point. I think that it will push the remaining ones out the door. The only thing is that...
Well, especially the entrepreneurs.
Oh my God! I mean,
the business owners.
And you don't, because the United States, the single biggest investment that you can make in your future is to renounce U.S. citizenship.
Yeah, well, that's been true for a while, even before this. But you're, like I said before, your wage and salary earner doesn't own a corporation, is not affected by this tax, and I think they can still pretty much continue along their merry way without too much impact until they decide to save for their retirement or retire.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it may be that as a percentage, there aren't enough people affected, so, there will be no support for the people who are affected. But this is absolutely over the top. It is, in my view, it is so much worse than any of the things that have happened up until now. But why do we think it applies?
Yeah, well, why is it not a treaty override?
Well, why do we think it applies? A, and if it does, why is it not a treaty override?
Yeah, okay.
They're separate issues, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other issue that we haven't talked about that we might want to raise briefly is, if there is a tax debt here, how does the IRS collect it?
Well, that's a good point, actually, because, now it doesn't mean the tax debt goes away, but, the Canada-U.S. tax treaty, which is similar to, I think, 4 or 5 other countries, the Netherlands, I think, Sweden, France, et cetera, actually has a provision that the IRS cannot ask the Canada Revenue Agency to collect a tax that accrues under the Internal Revenue Code on anybody who was a Canadian citizen at the time the tax debt arose. So, I don't think people want to be in the position of owing the U.S. tax, but if we separate the owing the tax from the collection issue, I do think that at least the way the treaty's written, I think that the IRS is going to have a collection problem. But you know what, Karen? The IRS has come out with, information on this, and they seem to, all the examples we're talking about corporations. It doesn't seem
all of the examples in the notice talk about subsidiaries of foreign subsidiaries of domestic corporations.
Yeah, so it doesn't
every single one.
It doesn't even.
And I've seen several people read through that and say, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me because I'm not a corporation.
Well, that's exactly right. The only way to get the conclusion or the idea that this would apply to individuals, you would never get it from the media, right? You would never get it from the IRS. You're only getting it from the tax compliance community. I'm not saying they're wrong, okay? But, you have to read the stuff in an extremely technical, precise way, to even be able to impose this tax logically, right, on individuals, let alone individuals who, are citizens and residents of other countries, right?
Exactly.
I think it's almost impossible to advise somebody here. It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds, but I think that, I hate to say it, but I would not, I think the last person you would ask for whether this applies is the tax compliance person. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
Don't know more than you do. They don't know more than you do about it if you've sat through this. The most they can say is, well, the way it's written, technically it applies to you.
Yeah, but the IRS doesn't seem to be including individuals in any of their instructions so far.
Well, that's right. That's right.
It's going to be very interesting to see what the tax forms look like when the IRS releases them.
Well, that's right. So this is the 12th of January, the 13th where you are. I think the 29th, that most exciting event, that annual event in the United States begins tax season. So people ought to be able to file by January 29th, and I guess one would look to the Form 5471s and see, if there's anything new about them or anything like that. I mean, there is, of course, a place to include subpart F income, so it's clearly open to you to do so.
Right.
But I mean, one would
expect, but look at the instructions. If the instructions don't tell you to do it, how are individual taxpayers supposed to know?
Well, they call up somebody in the tax compliance community. I mean, I think it's a terrible dilemma. I mean, to expect citizens and residents of other countries to hand over a portion of the retained earnings of their local corporations is, I mean, if it were intended, it would be pure confiscation.
Yep. Okay, so let's wrap this up. What have we learned? We've learned that this is a mess. That's what we learned.
Well, I think what we've learned is primarily, I think what is an indisputable fact, okay, is that it's practically impossible for any individual to comply with this.
It is going to require books and records that they don't even have anymore, most likely, especially if we've got a corporation that's been in existence since 1986 or earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, particularly the 962 election, the alternative D.
Yeah.
I mean, they might, I could imagine that small business owners might not even have those because the records go back so far.
Right. Right.
I don't know, Karen. I guess what I would say is it's not easy being a U.S. citizen living outside the United States, is it?
I'm certainly glad that I'm not in that position anymore.
Karen, it was the best investment decision you ever made.
It certainly was.
Yeah. Karen, on a personal level note, and I'm sure on behalf of anybody watching this, I really want to thank you for the absolute masterful job you've done in organizing those scenarios. I really appreciate your appearing and sharing the results of your work so generously in this format. And I hope that a lot of people benefit from this. You are Dr. Karen Alpert, and if I hadn't known that, I'd say you ought to be a teacher when you grow up.
Thanks, John.
But since I do know that, I'll tell you that I think you're a fabulous teacher. And also, for those who don't know, Karen is the originator of the FixTheTaxTreaty.org blog, which explores all the issues of how U.S. taxation might apply to Australian citizens and residents and all the problems that go along with that. So, if you, I encourage you to read that blog, and I would invite you to read my own also at citizenshipsolutions.ca. So I guess that sort of wraps it up, and thank you again, Karen.
Thank you, John.